This is Familiar Faces, an exploratory study analyzing the costs associated with 8 individuals who experienced persistent homelessness for much of the past 5 years, from 2013 to 2018. We call this cost study Familiar Faces because oftentimes when people experience long bouts of homelessness, we see them cycle throughout the medical, legal, and housing systems, thus becoming familiar faces to our service providers. Also, this study focuses on our local community, and these people are our neighbors, and they're familiar to us because we see their faces as we walk down the street. We worked with a variety of individuals, 3 women and 5 men, a mixture of people who are single, parents, not parents, a variety of ages, white and black. One of the women was a young adult, and one of the men is trans. Although it's not a perfect sample of the people in our community or of our homeless community, it is a broad sample with a variety of different experiences, as you will soon see. Alright, first off, we need to get through some boring definitions before we can get to the fun data. In order to gather information, we first needed to identify participants. Caseworkers would refer participants who may have been considered for supportive housing, people who they were already working with, who might be considered for supportive housing, or had a long history of homelessness prior to the start of the study. There were some people who don't quite fit this mold, but generally that was what we were looking for. Then, either myself or a caseworker, whatever the individual was most comfortable with, met one-on-one with each person. We interviewed them about their housing history over the past 5 years, where they had stayed and what types of services they had used. Then they signed releases of information for any agencies or in the area they may have utilized. I took those ROIs to the respective organizations to access financial and qualitative information regarding their utilization. One other thing I want to address quickly. This is what we call a cost study, but when I say cost, I don't necessarily mean that this is the amount of debt that each individual owes, or even that they have to exchange money for something, like when they utilize free clinics. I'm simply talking about the value of the services that they received. This is important because oftentimes that value ends up shouldered by taxpayers in some way. This can be very indirect, such as via taxpayer-funded Medicaid, or more direct through local taxes, such as for law enforcement, or housing programs that are funded through local taxes and grants, and even directly by the county itself. Alright, so I had mentioned that when we interviewed participants, we asked about their housing histories. Once we had those, we did our best to sort each month from 2013 to 2018 into one of these 5 housing categories. We assigned each month a category based on the worst level of housing they'd experienced, with homeless being the worst and stable housing being the best. Here, when we say homeless, we are encompassing every category of homelessness. Literal homelessness, which is often referred to when HUD talks about homelessness, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development talks about homelessness. And this is when people are staying in places not fit for human habitation, like emergency shelters, or on the street, or in parking garages, or even living out of their cars. However, we're also including times when people are at imminent risk of homelessness. So when maybe they have an eviction notice and really have nowhere else to go and are about to become homeless. Or they're couch surfing or living doubled up, where they may not be able to stay somewhere more than a few days at a time. We're also talking about those who are fleeing domestic violence and people who are categorized as homeless under other federal statutes. This usually encompasses young adults or families with children. Participants only needed to have experienced 1 day of the worst housing situation for that month to be categorized as such. This also comes from HUD. 1 day of homelessness a month, and that month is considered homeless. If they hadn't spent any time a month homeless, we moved on to see if they had been incarcerated. If they had for 1 day, the month was categorized as incarcerated, and if not, we continued on down the list. Now, transitional housing is usually considered homeless by HUD's standards. However, for this study, we wanted to analyze the information from transitional housing separately, since this service offers more support than traditional shelters. it's also worth noting that for these participants, transitional housing was a vastly different experience than homelessness was. It was a huge milestone and a success marker for them, and it was disingenuous to combine that with the other understandings of homelessness that we had looked at. So after we sorted each month into housing categories, we created these calendars for everyone. Now, in this chart, we're looking at each participant's calendars. Here, highlighted, we're looking at Carrie's calendar. The rows designate each year, and the columns designate each month. Each cell inside, then, is coded to one of the 5 housing categories that we discussed. Now, these calendars can immediately highlight how no one experiences homelessness the same way. There are some folks, like Carrie, Eli, and Marty, who experienced long, uninterrupted bouts of homelessness, while others, such as Jamie and Leo, would jump in and out of homelessness and some level of housing over a period of a few years. Now, I want to pull your attention over here to Catherine. We only have a 3-year housing history for her because she was the only young adult who participated in the study. She was 18 years old when we interviewed her, so we're only going back to when she was 15, not 13. Now, we didn't correct or change any of the costs for her, and we still included the costs for her in this study because her costs, even though we only have 3 years of it, are still higher than some people for whom we have 5 years of costs for. So these are the housing histories, and then this is what the costs look like for those housing histories. So over the past 5 years, these participants accrued over $1,200,000 in services while homeless. I want to draw your attention to this large blue section. This is the amount that Eli accrued while homeless. It accounts for about 57% of the total cost of this bar. This type of finding is actually pretty common. Other cost studies have found that between 10 to 20% of those experiencing homelessness typically account for up to 50% of the total cost of homelessness. In some areas and communities, the difference is far more dramatic and can account for up to 80% of the total cost of homelessness. We call these individuals super utilizers, frequent flyers, high-cost utilizers, all sorts of words that describe those who routinely cycle between the housing, legal, and medical systems, and tend to accrue high costs while doing so. So these are the total costs for each of these housing histories, but as we saw from the calendars, not everyone experienced the same amount of time in each housing category. It should be noted that over half the total time that we were looking at was spent homeless. Now, if we take that time into account, we can look at the average monthly cost per person. This chart creates a really nice staircase, where on average, participants are accruing costs of around $5,000 per month while homeless, whereas they're only accruing costs around $300 per month while stable. This is a huge difference, and although the reasons for this decrease are going to be different for every individual, it usually amounts to 2 broad explanations. First, a decrease in the number of services used. For example, when someone is stably housed, they don't need to use an emergency shelter. And a shift from expensive emergency services to less expensive preventative care. So this is the average monthly cost per person for the entire sample. But if we look at the same statistic and break it down for each individual, we see that everyone's stories emerge. Eli, of course, has extraordinarily high monthly costs, but it's worth pointing out that while experiencing homelessness, every participant, except for Leo, was accruing costs of over $1,000 per month, and oftentimes, although not always, when people moved into more stable housing, their costs would decrease. Now, Leo is the opposite of Eli, being the least expensive participant in the study, and I want to focus on his story first. So, Leo was stably housed at the beginning of this study. In 2014, he split from his long-term partner. That split led to depression, which then led to a job loss and spiraled into homelessness. His homelessness was literal. He lived out of his truck. When he got a job again, he managed to save up enough to provide for his own apartment. Another job loss, however, resulted in his second bout of homelessness. Although it is outside of the scope of this study, in November of 2018, he was connected with some rapid rehousing resources. Rapid rehousing is a short-term intervention that will provide a security deposit and several months' worth of rent to help get people back on their feet. Leo only needed 2 months' worth of assistance and now is stably housed. So as I mentioned, Leo is the lowest cost participant in this study. In total, he accrued a little over $3,000 in services over the past 5 years, regardless of housing situation. While homeless, he only utilized $620 worth of housing services. I bring this up because I neglected to mention that Leo has a son, and every weekend in the summer and every other weekend in the winter, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Leo has custody of his kid. Now, while he was homeless, Leo didn't want his son to have to stay in his truck, so he would rent hotel rooms. If we take those costs into account, he spent about $17,000 on a very immediate but short-term solution to ensure that his son had a safe place to stay. If he had been able to connect with housing services earlier, it's possible that this money could instead have been spent on more permanent solutions and could have been put towards a saving account or helping get his son new shoes or something to that nature, instead of having this giant leak in a bucket that he's constantly trying to fill so that he'll be able to save up enough for a new apartment. Next, I want to talk about Jamie. He also jumped in and out of homelessness, only more sporadically than Leo did. At the beginning of this study, he was living with a close friend, a person he called his brother. However, he found out he had to leave that December, and this led to homelessness. His homelessness would routinely look like a mixture of literal homelessness and couch hopping, staying with friends where he could, but he would never be sure if he was able to stay there for several months at a time or if he would have to leave within a few days. At the end of 2014, he was living with a friend, acting as a caretaker for them. That lasted until his friend passed away in June, leading once again to his homelessness. In 2016, he got rental assistance via an SSVF program. He lived in that apartment for about a year, but ended up losing it due to a non-payment of rent. Homeless again, he got an apartment again, and lost that due to a non-renewal of lease. Finally, he got connected with HACAP, and they provided some assistance to help him get into a new place. His housing, even when it was in his name, has never really been stable because when he can maintain housing, he would rarely pay all of his rent on time, even though it usually would be in full each month. And so if he didn't have very forgiving and understanding landlords, he would not have been able to maintain any housing during this time frame. In addition to looking at costs, we also looked at the number of interactions or encounters with each system that participants accrued. For Jamie, when he was housed, even though it wasn't super stable and his housing was usually at risk due to his income, he was able and willing to access services more often, which is why you see this increase in interactions. Part of this has to do with the fact that he was less willing to go to the hospital when he was homeless. According to him, he would only go when he really had no other choice, when he felt like his life was in danger when he was outside. Now, this isn't great, especially for Jamie. He has schizophrenia and has been experiencing hallucinations for years. Mental health services are absolutely necessary for him if he wants to remain functional, let alone stable. This is easily seen when we look at his medical interactions. The vast majority of them are directly related to mental health. Again, the greater number of interactions while at risk, the most stable housing he experienced, is explained by him being able to access services more readily than while homeless, not because he needed services more often while at risk than while homeless, just that he could access them more. However, this also means that while Jamie was homeless, he was often accessing emergency services more often. No time or ability to access preventative care. That's why, even though he had more interactions while at risk, his costs were lower while at risk than while homeless. Again, this is due to the fact that he had to access more expensive emergency care while homeless, and he could access far less expensive preventative care while housed. Even if the housing wasn't stable, it was more stable than homelessness was. Next, I'm going to talk about Carrie. Carrie was homeless for years prior to the start of this study. Her homelessness consisted of a lot of couch surfing, domestic violence, the living doubled up. Occasionally, she would experience literal homelessness as well. In 2017, she was entered into the Catherine McCulley Center's Transitional Housing Program. At the end of that year, she exited that program into stable housing, and with continued support from the Catherine McCulley Center, she has maintained that stability to this day. So, Carrie is an example of what we would love to see from everyone. She was someone who, on average, had very high costs while experiencing homelessness, but those average costs per month decreased as she moved into more and more stable housing. In fact, not only did her costs decrease, but her utilization of services decreased as well. Even when accounting for the amount of time she spent in each housing category, we see a decrease in the average number of interactions per month, which is really phenomenal. We also see a decrease or a shift in how many types of interactions she's having. In an ideal world, we wouldn't see very many, if any, housing or legal interactions, because that implies that people are not needing housing services, which means that ideally they are able to find and provide for themselves without too much trouble. And they would not need legal services, which means that ideally they are not getting into any legal trouble or needing that legal intervention. However, in an ideal world, we would still be accessing medical services for checkups and preventative care so that, for example, we are aware of what's going on in our body and things like that. So it's really great that we see that shift in the types of interactions that she's having as well. This is due to not needing to access services as frequently, but also because she shifts utilization from emergency care to preventative care. This is exemplified by her hospital interactions. Now here, we're looking at any interaction that went through the local hospital systems, be that through the emergency department, through a scheduled appointment, an urgent care clinic, a regular doctor's visit, not necessarily through the hospitals themselves or at the hospitals themselves. Now, while Carrie was homeless and in transitional housing, the majority of these interactions with the hospital systems were through the emergency department. However, when she entered stability, only one interaction was through the emergency department. This is huge. A shift from expensive emergency room interactions to less expensive preventative care interactions. We see this reflected in a cost decrease and an increase in her quality of life. Finally, I want to talk about Eli. Like Carrie, he had been homeless for years prior to the start of this study. His homelessness was literal. He would sleep in car parks, outside, in tents when he could. In 2017, he was entered into a rapid rehousing program. Now, Eli is someone who's well known in the homeless community and had a hard time saying no to those who needed a place to stay. So, while he was in his apartment, there would usually be between 9 and 12 other people sleeping there on any given night. It was due to this and other reasons that at the end of 2017, he ended up losing that housing and falling back into homelessness. Fortunately, in October 2018, Eli was entered into a supportive housing program and has been in that program for a year. So, we know that Eli's costs are incredible, but so were his interactions. He is the most frequent utilizer of both legal and medical services in this sample, but not the most frequent utilizer of housing services. It's possible that if he was connected to housing services earlier, he really only started accessing services in 2016, then we wouldn't see costs quite as extraordinary as this. So, as I said before, Eli was entered into supportive housing in October 2018. Now, really quickly, I want to address some of the language that I've been using. For those of us who are used to housing jargon, you may be expecting me to use the phrase permanent supportive housing as opposed to supportive housing. Well, to explain why I'm using different language, let's look at what permanent supportive housing, or PSH, is. The term PSH is strongly associated with HUD's definition of PSH, and often implies that an organization is receiving HUD funding. PSH, when provided as purely a housing service, can really only get HUD funding if it is serving those who are chronically homeless. In order to be considered chronically homeless, you either must have experienced 12 consecutive months of homelessness in the past year, or had 4 bouts of homelessness over the past 3 years, totaling to 12 months of homelessness. Then, homelessness must meet these 3 criteria. It must have been literal, so it doesn't count if they were couch surfing most or much of that time. Their homelessness must have been documented, and they must have a documented disabling condition. Now, this disabling condition can include alcohol or substance abuse, but the requirements for literal homelessness and documentation are already putting up barriers that many of the participants in this study do not meet, even though many of them would still benefit greatly from supportive housing. In fact, Eli is the only participant who met these conditions. Thus, we're using the looser local phrase persistent homelessness to describe participants, being inclusive of different types of homelessness and not requiring documentation for disabling conditions. Additionally, the supportive housing units that Willis Dady oversees and that Eli is a part of are targeting this persistently homeless population, and although they are of the same model as PSH, they do not receive any HUD funding, so we can better and more wholly serve those in our community who truly need it. So, as I said before, Eli was entered into supportive housing in October 2018, and the middle of October 2019 marked his 1-year anniversary of being housed, so we can easily compare the year before he was housed in supportive housing to the year afterwards. Let's start off by looking at interactions. Eli's housing interactions, the number of times he's accessed housing services in such a way as to be measured, has increased from 8 to 22 interactions, an increase of 175%, which is actually a good thing. For him, this is the longest time he has remained housed in one place in over a decade, which is really phenomenal. In addition to the interactions we see here, although it's not recorded, he is popping into housing services on a daily basis to check in and maintain support with case managers, and is accessing other very small and low-cost services that are harder to track, such as acquiring bus tickets or attending free meal sites. When we look at his legal interactions, we see a huge decrease, about 57% from 47 interactions to 20. No, they haven't dropped down to 0, but both his court interactions and his calls to service have decreased. Generally speaking, a call to service doesn't hold any moral context. It's just that anytime someone has an interaction with an officer, that is recorded. However, calls to service still take time, and time equals money, so a decrease is great. Especially in regards to these calls, a decrease also indicates that officers have a little bit more time to spend on other emergencies instead of addressing frequent flyers like Eli. Now, finally, his medical interactions have also dropped as well, at about a 70% decrease from the year before. Although we don't end up seeing the same shift from emergency care to preventative care that we saw with Carrie, just seeing this drop is phenomenal, and it again translates into financial savings. Now, speaking of money, this graph shows the financial difference in the amount of money in the services Eli was accruing the year before supportive housing to the year after. It's a huge difference, about an 80% decrease in costs, and that is including the cost of his supportive housing unit, as well as supportive housing case management services. So this decrease, if we want to call it a cost savings, has already covered the 13 months inclusive of Eli having his apartment from mid-October to mid-October. The additional amount, $316,000-odd, can cover almost 456 more months of supportive housing in terms of management fees, assuming the costs of supportive housing stay constant. I haven't projected this into the future to look at what inflation will do. Now, that's either almost 38 years alone for Eli, or a little over 7.5 years for all 5 supportive housing units together. And that's just one person's cost savings. So, although I gave you a brief overview of the cost of homelessness report, this is still not all of what I looked at in my full report. You can access that report in the description box below if you are watching this video on YouTube. Otherwise, you can find it on Willis Dady's website.